Today, scientists, billionaires, futurists, and philosophers all converged last week on Vancouver, British Columbia for the first TED conference in almost 3 years.
And we'll take you inside. We'll share some of the talks that galvanized the room and dig into climate science, Ukraine, and majestic robots.
I'm Laura Fitton. This is Future Forward.
I am Steven Rosenbaum. Let us launch. Hey, Laura.
Welcome back, Steve. I will just say right up front, I'm super envious. I've always wanted to go to TED. I am privileged and lucky enough to have, or years ago at least, I had the invite. I've just never been able to put it all together and make it happen. It's quite out of reach.
I've been going for a decade, and it is, I will tell you, I go to a lot of conferences, I go to a lot of tech gatherings, a lot of things on democracy. It's the only place where you can sit down and have dinner and end up having an hour-long conversation with a neuroscientist. I mean, part of what makes it special is how diverse the audience is. And they've worked really hard to make it more diverse over these last couple of years. And, it's been essentially virtual, online only for the last 2 years. And so this was everyone back in the conference hall in Vancouver. And it was a little like a glass of water for somebody who's very thirsty. It was a good week. Now, having said that, we're going to play some clips of some talks and talk about some things. It was also in some ways a hard year because, TED was born in the era of techno-utopianism, and it has had to evolve into this whatever. I don't know if we have a name for whatever we're in now, but it's hard to have a
techno-utopianism anymore. That's for sure.
And it is certainly hard to have kind of a glossy view of the future, given the provably grim things we're facing.
And yet, so what an important time to get all those minds in one space interacting. I hope, whether, some of the topics that I wished were on stage that weren't, I hope they were at least happening in the hallways and the dinners.
Well, I was only at a couple of those, so I don't know, so let's just start with, the conversation, the very first TED Talk. And there's a little bit, some of the video was released. They always release a little of it right after the conference. And so we'll show a little bit, we'll play a clip, and then we'll talk about it. But the very first talk on the very first day was Kasparov. And, I've heard him speak before. He's a compelling speaker. He's brilliant and Russian. But his talk was about Ukraine.
Yes.
Here, let me see if I can make the tech work and just play a little clip.
Five years ago, I was on this stage to talk about the relationships between humans and machines. Today, I'm here to talk only about the relationships between humans. I regularly say in my lectures on artificial intelligence that humans will always have a monopoly on evil. It's not a threat, just a reminder that people choose. We're not algorithms. We're not bound by code or commandments or laws or treaties. We have them, but we choose. So let us talk now about the choices we make, about things in black and white, about Russia's war on Ukraine, and about good and evil. My life experience prepared me to identify evil at an early age. Not my life as the chess player, not even as the youngest world champion in history. No, my relevant experience is where I was born and raised in what Ronald Reagan accurately called the evil empire.
So, a couple of things. When you're the curator of a conference like this and you put this person on stage with this point of view, you're making kind of an unambiguous political statement about how Ted feels about Russia and how Ted feels about Ukraine. Now, maybe that's easy to do given Putin's actions, but Ted is often very careful to be nonpartisan, and this was a case where they clearly wanted to plant the flag.
Yeah, I think being anti-genocide isn't too partisan. I think that's a pretty core morality when you pull politics aside. But anyway,
I know. Well, yeah, yes, certainly, but so again, this is part of the part of the extraordinary nature of this gathering. So in the afternoon before this first talk, I went to get a cup of coffee and was standing in the Loop, which is the circular space outside the conference hall, and they're standing there, kind of in his own thoughts. What was Kasparov, and I just walked up to him and we chatted for 10 minutes. And he's an interesting persona. He's kind of, when he talks about AI, you have to remember that he was beaten by AI. There is that. But we ended up in this fairly detailed conversation about truth, which was great and very memorable for me. And I assumed he was going to. So what was interesting about this talk was you could have done a talk about the complexities of the world and, the USSR and how it's evolved and, Putin's, coming out of, the military, the good and evil distinction kind of drew a fairly clear line. But also, I think, in terms of the TED decision, it also, you couldn't not talk about Ukraine, but they also didn't want the 3 days to be about Ukraine. And so the decision was, I think, no one told me this, but I took it as, we're going to hit it. We're going to hit it hard. We're going to address it. We're going to make clear that we have a feeling about it. And then we're going to move on to other things.
Wise choice.
Yeah, well, it certainly worked. The two big topics before we get to, Musk, who ended up.
Oh, was Elon there?
Yeah.
I'm
well,
kidding.
no, no one knew. So we'll talk about that in a minute.
No one knew he was going to be there?
No, he was on the schedule.
Right.
But he was grayed out.
Huh.
And no one knew what that meant. It meant either that he hadn't posted his profile in the little app thing, but he was coming, or that he had, it was unclear. And I think my guess is, given the week that we just had with him, you have to remember, in addition to being a persona, he's also a human being who had to get wherever he was, had to get on an airplane and go through customs. And even if it's private, I'm sure it's private, but
it is
maybe
private.
He doesn't have to go.
There's a Twitter account for his jet.
Yeah. Anyway, but let's save him for the back half of the pod, because there's a lot to talk about there. So the two big topics that I am mulling, and that's why I thought of you, obviously, the lot of talk about climate. And there were many, many, many talks, and I tried to scribble down the ones that I thought Al Gore gave a fiery, slightly speechy, angry talk, which, he didn't really say anything particularly new. He also there was a dinner that I didn't go to, in which I'm told he was quite angry. But to me, that's
emblematic of the concern I have, that I don't think politics is ever going to fix climate. Hopefully it will, but I think it's going to be a laggard.
So the two talks I wanted to talk to you about, one was, I'm going to mispronounce her first name, Vieta Cowan, who talked about green hydrogen, which I literally, sitting in the room, thought, I have to ask Laura about this because I literally didn't understand her.
Sure.
I mean, it had green in it, which I assume means good.
Well, and it has green in it because most hydrogen synthesis is extremely, extremely dirty. Yes, hydrogen technically would be a clean fuel if we could just have hydrogen. But when you make hydrogen, it requires, breaking the H2O bond in water, generally, hydrolysis. And that is very energetically expensive. So the thing that's holding hydrogen back, because it's like, it's technically green in how it burns. So it's technically green fuel that you can take with you. You can't put wind and solar onto an airplane because there's no effective suitcase for it, right? You put it in a battery and you put that on the plane, and then the battery's heavy and it's hard to run and it just doesn't work, right? So we can't electrify certain energy needs in the world, and hydrogen, if it could be made green, is always the big asterisk on it, would be a great way to do that. So there's a lot of smart people looking at how do we make it green? And it kind of requires infinite green energy to make green hydrogen. And so there are some ways we could look at, I don't know if you know that one of the things holding back renewables, the ones that are like, wind and solar, already very, very cost effective, already very, very economically beneficial. One of the things holding it back is this concept of curtailment. And this is the idea that if it's making tons of juice when we don't need juice, we literally just spill that juice on the ground. We're just like, oh, that's nice wind, bye. And we stop the rotors, or we, dump the energy out of the solar system, basically the solar power generation system. So one idea is if you could co-locate hydrogen generation so that it's slurping up some of that spilled power, then it could be made green. I don't know her specific approach. The problem is it's much like fusion in that once it technologically works and becomes energy positive instead of energy negative, right? And right now it takes more energy to do it, and it's dirty energy, then it actually benefits us in terms of the net carbon impact. So looking at the list of talks you sent me, I did not get the chance to look at all their climate talks and see all the voices they pulled forward. They put up some of the more technologically utopian solutions, making nuclear fission actually scalable and acceptable to societies, right? That is a long shot. Would the results of it be great? Yes. But it is a long, long shot that we've been hacking at for decades. Green hydrogen, we'll get there someday. And we need to.
So nuclear came up a bunch of times. Elon threw in there kind of as a sidebar that he's pro-nuclear. The person they put on the stage to be their nuclear advocate was a woman named Isabel. I'm going to mispronounce her last name, Bomecki, who I did not like at all. She calls herself a nuclear influencer, and she's created this kind of TikTok cartoon character that preaches the gospel of nuclear. And I found her to be, she used this phrase 3 times, and each time it made the hair stand up on the back of my neck. She calls herself a humble influencer, which I just think is a contradiction in terms that is not resolvable. And essentially her argument was, we're scared of nuclear because we think of nuclear weapons. But the evidence that she seemed to have dug up from Wikipedia or somewhere was that nuclear actually is perfectly safe and actually clean, and we should just get over the PR problem it has.
There is a lot of evidence that nuclear is clean. So let's separate her likability, because that's super problematic, especially with women. Let's separate her likability from the facts. The facts she's outlining are not entirely wrong. The thing I think she's really glossing over, and again, I haven't watched the talk, I've just read the summary. I think the thing she's really glossing over is the political feasibility. Also, I think it's useful in nuclear to talk about fission and fusion because they're so different. I presume here from looking at this, she's talking more about the fission side of nuclear, which is the nuclear we think of it as the nuclear we have now. Fusion is the nuclear we dream about that would be freaking amazing if we can get it, again, net positive in terms of energy. Right now, fusion, it works, but it doesn't work to generate energy. It works to consume energy. Fission is the one that's way more dangerous, way more politically sensitive. Is it true that, if you look at the overall safety per kilowatt hour of nuclear power that's been generated on Earth so far? Yes, it is way safer than many other sources. We know people are dying of coal generation. We absolutely know people are dying of fossil fuel generation, right? It is very few people. But the political will it takes to get a plant built, and waste really isn't solved. We don't have good things to do with the waste we've already generated. Certainly in America, it's very, very unlikely that any new fission plants can come online in a meaningful time. This is the other variable of nuclear. Sorry to interrupt myself. The other really important meaningful variable of nuclear is, yes, once we solve these problems, it's kind of infinite energy in a way, but can we solve these problems in a meaningful time frame for climate? We've had decades to solve them. If we solved them 2 decades ago, they would have made a meaningful difference for climate. If they were solved today, they would have made a meaningful difference for climate. Unless we start showing these things work by like 2025, 2030, they're not going to get here in time. And so it's, that yes, we need some new inventions and some technical utopias, but I focus all my work on let's look at the intersection of the capitalism we have now today, as flawed as it is, and the climate technologies we have today, as limited as some of them are. And let's just scale what we have better, right? While we're working out all these technical utopias.
So, and by the way, my criticism of her is not about her. It's just that I thought the decision to make an advocate into a cartoon seemed for that room unnecessary. Anyway, moving on to the elephant in the room. So here's where we are on Elon. So Elon was supposed to speak on Thursday. Nobody knew if he was actually going to show up. The news kept changing. First, he was an investor in Twitter. Then he was going to be on the Twitter board. Then he wasn't going to be on the Twitter board. Then he was going to buy Twitter. This was all happening in real time. And so there wasn't anybody at the conference who wasn't talking about it. And I think until Wednesday night.
And I don't think that was a coincidence, honestly. I think it was very well timed to take advantage of TED, or to use that opportunity, not take advantage, but
I think you give him too much credit for being that strategic. Well,
he's very PR savvy. He is very PR savvy.
So what we now know, and we're not going to show it, we won't play it on the pod just because we don't have time, was that they had gone to Austin. Chris Anderson, who's the leader of TED, and a camera crew had gone to Austin 2 weeks earlier and recorded an 80-minute sit-down interview with Elon at the new Gigafactory before it opened, and toured the Gigafactory. I think because they determined he wasn't going to be on stage, and they were going to use this interview or pieces of it to be the Elon presentation. And I think, and that is going to be published, maybe even as soon as this afternoon. And 80 minutes of Elon is, you don't get many people who he gives 80 minutes to. So let me just play a little bit of the beginning of the talk, and then I'll tell you why I think it's so fascinating and at the same time problematic.
Now then, hearing from Elon live, there's huge public interest in that. We have opened up this segment to live stream, and so we're joined right now by, I think, quite a few people around the world. Welcome to Vancouver, welcome to TED 22. You're joining us on the last day of our conference here in a packed theater. And we've been hearing all week from people with dreams about what the next era of humanity is going to be. And now, arguably, the biggest visionary of them all, Elon Musk. Hey, Elon, welcome. So, Elon, a few hours ago, you made an offer to buy Twitter. Why?
How'd you know?
Little bird tweeted in my ear or something. I don't know.
By the way, have you seen the movie Ted about the bear?
I have.
It's a good movie.
Don't mention that here.
Yeah. So, was there a question?
Why make that offer?
Well, I think it's very important for there to be an inclusive arena for free speech, where all, Twitter has become kind of the de facto town square. It's just really important that people have both the reality and the perception that they're able to speak freely within the bounds of the law. So one of the things that I believe Twitter should do is open source the algorithm and make any changes to people's tweets. If they're emphasized or de-emphasized, that action should be made apparent so anyone can see that action has been taken.
So I love that for its meandering complexity.
That clip?
Well, the
Or that
whole
I see
thing
at
was
the
like,
end?
I mean, no. I mean, so let's just unpack that for 1 second. Chris asks a question which clearly was predictable. It wasn't a gotcha. It wasn't. And Elon's response is long, strange, awkward pause, mention random movie with the name Ted in it, act uncomfortable again, seem to lose his way, and then say, is there a question? Now, I don't think that's performance art. I think he's on the spectrum and not particularly good at interpersonal interaction. And even though he and Chris know each other a long time and are friendly, I mean, I don't want to say friendly. They're colleagues. I don't know their relationship, but enough that he trusts Chris to not attack him, and still comes off kind of befuddled by, why did you offer to buy Twitter?
I'm not buying it. It's totally an act. I don't think he's befuddled. I think he knew the question was coming. He was stalling for time, and he was also putting his interviewer on the back foot by being completely random and whimsical and distracting, and obviously not dodging the question because he knew he wasn't going to be able to dodge it. I actually thought that was a very interesting manipulation of his interviewer. But
Yeah,
maybe
so
he really is that. Maybe he is what he's seeming to be. I don't quite trust him enough to believe that. And yet at the end, so this is where I watched about 2/3 of this before we had to go to record this morning. I was surprised how many times I agreed with what he wanted to see happen at Twitter. He is not wrong that Twitter is not working. He is not wrong that Twitter is not living up to his potential. There's a lot of stuff that I don't see how he rectifies in his mind about how this would all play out. And yet I'm still vehemently against him owning Twitter and doing this hostile takeover. And I was very encouraged to see late last night some coverage of Twitter's board looking at poison pill options to avoid the hostile takeover.
So I don't know the answer to this, but I think about it, so his brilliance, he's an engineer. He's on the spectrum. Chris played the clip from Saturday Night Live where he talked about, which I thought was an interesting decision. I worry that the things that make him a good builder of cars and rocket ships, like the complexity of language and interpersonal things, like he alternately says, I have a vision for Twitter, and then says, well, I really don't have that thought through. Maybe I'm open to suggestions. And so, for example, Chris very gently, I don't have it queued up, so I'm not going to play it, but very gently kind of unpack this. Okay, so somebody posts, I don't like X politician on Twitter. Fine. Somebody posts, I don't like X politician and I wish they weren't alive.
Right.
Question mark. Somebody
That
posts, I don't like
escalation
X policy, and I put a picture of them with a gun target on their face and their home address. And this is what all these social media platforms are struggling with, which is, where's the line between free speech and the threat of violence? And if Elon had a good publicity team behind him, they would have gamed that out and he would have had a good answer. And he was like, well, And then he kind of fell back on the law, which I thought was odd. Like, well, fire in a crowded theater is illegal. And then he kind of paused and said, is it? Well, check with the Supreme Court. I mean, but net, I guess, this word free speech is being used cavalierly. And I believe that the right more than the left is willing to use it as a bludgeon.
They use it as a very cynical bludgeon, right? They have plenty of free speech. The what ifs and the examples that Chris and Elon go through during the course of this, I kept thinking that's exactly how Twitter is today. Can someone I don't like tweet something I don't like? Absolutely. And in fact, the majority of deceptive, outright lying, outright hate speech tweets do stand. Only the worst ones ever get taken down. You watch what Cawthorn and Marjorie Taylor Greene and all those are able to tweet on the regular. And then you come back a few days later thinking, well, surely that one got taken down because that really crossed the line. And it didn't. Right. So he's painting this picture as if Twitter has some authoritative grip and is taking down everything. And I could not rectify in my mind, he disclosed on stage here that he has this almost perverse relationship with the truth, that he has almost this like unhealthy, like the truth is so important to me in almost an unbalanced way. I am actually the same way. It's literally the Fitton family motto, woe to the deceitful heart. It's like our old Latin motto. I struggle with rectifying that Elon who's saying, oh, just the truth is so important to me, with free speech Elon. Because so many of the things that they lob, oh, free speech, blah, 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 were outright lies. I was encouraged. The other place I was surprised to see myself shaking my head and going, yes, that would be good. I was encouraged by his focus on tearing out the spam bots. I mean, those are so findable. I don't think it's excusable in this day and age of tech that Twitter lets so many of them run on for so long, especially because that is a major attack vector for international security at this point. And it's been talked about for 6 years. And yet there's still, Tony 867123 spouting Kremlin propaganda on the regular.
So he's talked about decentralized Twitter, and he's talked about putting all the code base on GitHub. And that I think is interesting, but only because it would mean one Twitter would be replaced by 10,000 Twitters. And, I ended up
which, by the way, that tech exists, right? In the early days of Twitter, there were a million different versions of Twitter. There were a lot of jumping on board like, oh, that's cool, let me write that. And decentralized Twitter, it just never got enough critical mass to take over. I think, it was very techno-utopian and whatnot, but those lines of code have been written and have been attempted. So I actually do think that's interesting.
But so I ended up talking to Eli Pariser about exactly this. And I said to him, isn't everyone has their own Twitter with their own community, talking to their own people about their own ideas? Isn't that essentially the filter bubble that you wrote about 10 years ago coming true? And, he kind of nodded his head. And I think that at the end of the day, I mean, by the way, play this out as an alternative. Here's an alternative. You spin up a Twitter, anyone can join it, anyone can have a conversation in it, but when it reaches some finite number of members, 1,000, 200, 1,000,000, whatever it is, it stops letting new people join and says, you go to the next community of 500 or like having it be, because the biggest problem with Twitter for me is that at the end of the day, the loudest voices just drowned everybody else out. And I want you to remember about Elon, this is the same person who tweeted 3 days ago, maybe we should take Twitter and remove the W from its name.
Right. No, he's a mess. I mean, even if all of his ideas were correct, I don't think a single billionaire should own Twitter, no matter how much I agreed or disagreed with him. I think he personally is a bit of a train wreck in terms of who to have that kind of power. But that doesn't mean some of his critiques aren't accurate. And so I'm being the bigger person here and admitting, like, no, he's right about a couple of these things, some very important things.
So let's end the podcast with my wild prediction that you'll hear here first for the first time. I don't think he'll end up owning Twitter. I think there's plenty of money out there that has deeper pockets, resources. Not, I mean, he's the most individually wealthy buyer, but there are other buyers, and I would like to breathe out into the universe the buyer that I think would be the best buyer and would change the web in really positive ways. I think Tim Cook should buy it for Apple. And I think it should be a subscription product. And I think he's got the right moral center of gravity. And I think he doesn't own anything in social. And I think they would be really rigorous about how they build it.
It's an interesting idea. I'm going to have to process more before I say yes or no, but I'm a no lean. Put me on record as a leaned no. At one point, I actually thought Apple would acquire Twitter because I thought a long time ago they were eyeing and grooming Jack Dorsey as the next Steve Jobs.
That's interesting.
And they didn't do it then when they could have. Owning Square and Twitter would have been amazing, and then having Jack would be very Apple. I hope it stays independent. It is a public good. It is a public square. I always wanted to see it go protocol level, right? Like think of email. There are lots of different listservs. There's one-to-one. There's more public ones. They're interoperable, right? Many different Twitters that are interoperable and that are not all owned by the corporate entity, I think would be a really, really interesting thing to have and would help balance out some of these public versus private concerns.
We are out of time. We will find this out. I get the feeling that we'll talk about Elon again, and I will try and watch the whole thing and pull some better clips next time. But thank you this was fun.
I have to say props to Ted. I did not realize they had live streamed it. And I, in fact, tweeted at one point this week, like, gosh, this is a really important conversation. People should be able to hear it. So I'm eating my words here on the pod and saying I'm very glad that they were and that everybody can watch it now. So go watch it.
All right. Talk to you soon. Bye.